So thanks everyone for joining today and taking some time, and for those who might be listening at another time. So the focus of the talk today will be on youth and adolescent athletes. So those that are on club teams, high school teams, certainly we'll have some time at the end where we can answer other questions. I spend most of my time with our national teams, so I have a pretty good understanding there of some of the, other age groups as well. So love to entertain any of those questions at the end. I think it's a pretty common question that is asked: are dietary supplements safe for adolescent athletes? And when I sort of have the opportunity to look at the short answer, I think we don't know. Most of the products, not all of them, but most have not been tested rigorously for their effectiveness and their long-term safety in younger populations. Um, when we move on to sort of the long answer, I think it depends. And we'll talk about why really it depends with sort of going through all of these different categories. But the first thing that I think about is sort of how do you define dietary supplements and which supplements are you referring to? And so we'll talk about that as the what. The second part is that adolescents can range. It depends on whose definition you're looking at. But if we think about some of our children as well, we could be looking at 10 to 19-year-olds. So we're looking at a pretty long range of age and a lot of different things going on in that developmental stage of that group. So a 10-year-old is pretty different than your 17-year-old. Have they experienced growth spurts, maturation of organs? Do they have elevated sex steroid hormones? So just knowing that it's such a broad category, there's so many physiological and maturational changes that are taking place. It's really difficult to have a concrete answer there. So that's going to be our who. And then the third part of that is really, why do they want to take the supplements? What's the purpose that we're shooting for here? What are the benefits that we're looking for? And that can, sometimes maybe help with the short. Is it going to be effective for what they're trying to do? Or is it not? Or is it going to be safe for them? And then the fourth is really kind of, when are they looking to take them? When would they utilize that product? When would they utilize that option? Would they try it in a certain part of their training block? And that might be important. What are they trying to achieve during training at that time? Are they taking the supplement in lieu of other food, or are we taking it to support and supplement the foods that we're currently eating? So those are some of the things that I want to sort of take you through over the course of this talk. And I think the last thing to kind of consider here is just that we know that adolescent athletes are taking supplements. So we know that from data, we know that from observations, we know that from questions. And lots of times, they're looking to people for answers and they want to know, is this good for them? And they're asking friends and they're asking parents and they're asking Google and they're probably asking you. So my ultimate goal here is to help you be as prepared as you can be to answer those questions or create some awareness. And if you aren't sure, then tell them that. Tell them you don't know, but you will help them find an answer to that. So I think it's also just building up your toolbox to make sure that you have people and resources and referrals that you could send an athlete to if you don't know the answer to that. So first question, what are dietary supplements? The FDA defines dietary supplements as something that is intended to add to or to supplement the diet. It's different than conventional food. And what we also know is that it has different labels, and we'll talk a little bit more about that than conventional foods, and we'll talk about how they might differ. But it comes in different forms, all different dietary supplements. They could be tablets, capsules, gels, powders, liquids, gummies, bars, all different things like that. And I think what sometimes people don't realize is that your typical sports drink, that you might drink during practice that has carbohydrate and electrolytes in it, that's a dietary supplement, and that fits under this category. And so that's different than, let's say, if you were to have orange juice when you are on the court training. And so even just things like your typical bar that you might grab, a lot of those bars fit into the dietary supplement category. And that might depend on what's in them also. And so some of those could have a food label or some of them could have a supplement label depending on those ingredients. So some kind of common examples here, I would say, are things like your vitamins, your minerals, your botanicals. Botanicals are things like ginger, maybe something that comes from a plant, things like amino acids, and then live microbials, which are going to be maybe like your probiotics. I think one thing that's really important to consider with dietary supplements is that the regulation is very different than our food supply. And so the FDA does actually not have the authority and does not approve dietary supplements for safety or for efficacy, and they don't approve their labeling before a supplement is sold to the public. And so there is one exception there, and that is if a dietary supplement has a new ingredient, then there's a different process for approval. But basically what that means is that if I would like to go home and make my own protein powder and put it into some containers and sell that to all of you at the end of this presentation, I could do that. And so I don't have to get approval from the FDA. They don't have to test it. They're not checking to make sure that that protein powder is effective. They're not making sure that that product has only what it says it has in the bottle. And that's concerning to me. And so hopefully that's a little bit concerning to you as well. And so I think that that's just always where my default goes whenever an athlete says, hey, should I take this? And so there's some things that we can do, and we're going to talk a little bit about maybe just like some tips to navigate the supplement world. But I think in general is just sort of always keeping that in the back of your mind. So if you take a look at these labels here, you'll notice that dietary supplements are required to have labels on them. They're typically called like a supplement label, or it will say like a calcium supplement or, some type of vitamin or mineral supplement. And they need to have serving size. They need to have servings in the container. They need to have all the ingredients in there. So there's guidelines about what they need to include. It's just there's nobody checking that in advance. And instead, what the FDA does is they have an adverse monitoring process, meaning that if a supplement is out on the shelf and there are problems with it and people report that to the FDA, that they will go investigate it after the fact. So after people have taken it, if they've had some kind of issues with it or concerns with it, then they'll go back to it. And so you'll notice that it's a little bit different than our food label, which is in the white, the supplement label that's going to be on the left there. And I think the final point here that I'll leave you with before we move on is that it's a really lucrative business. So in 2017, the global revenue of dietary supplements was estimated to be about $9 billion, and it's expected to double by 2025. And so that's not even 10 years. And so there's a lot of people involved in this industry. There's a lot of people making a lot of money, and that's their goal. And so it's just with everything else. And I think that we want to keep that in mind as well. The goal isn't athlete safety. The goal isn't how's that going to impact a developing brain that's 12 years old. So I just think it's important to keep those things in mind when we're thinking about all these different types of products. So dietary supplements cover a pretty wide range of categories as well. And as you can imagine, if you've ever been into a vitamin shop or just even a Whole Foods section where all the dietary supplements, or the grocery store or Target or anything like that, it takes up a lot of space and there's so many choices out there. We're only going to focus on a really small portion of that in this discussion here. And I want to focus mostly on sport supplements because I think that those are the questions that people are asking. And hopefully that's the space that I can provide maybe the most expertise in. Keeping in mind that certainly there are lots of other supplements that athletes might be taking that fit into some of the other categories. And so they might want to, say, should I take a turmeric or a ginger? Should I take something like that for an anti-inflammatory benefit? We're not going to cover that scope in here, but certainly happy to answer some of those questions at the end. So when I think about sport supplements, we can split them into a couple different categories, and this is done a variety of different ways. But one of those incorporates kind of our nutrients, and those conversations certainly I think do come up with athletes. and they are surrounded around things like vitamin D and iron and calcium and omegas. And that list can go on and on. It might be vitamin C, it might be our B vitamins, B12, all of those different things. And so that's kind of one category. I think they can influence performance. Oftentimes we're using those to treat maybe a deficiency or something that we're maybe not getting in our diet. But they can have a really key role in performance and recovery. And for some of them, we might be best suited with looking into a blood test to understand what are our vitamin D levels or what are our iron levels before we would move on to taking a dietary supplement, and or symptoms that we might be experiencing. So if we have a stress fracture, then we might think about vitamin D and calcium and some of those things. The next category that I think about then is kind of our sport foods. And I already talked about that just a little bit. Just to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page there, that these are like our bars and these are our sports drinks and there are gels and our gummies and all of those types of things. And typically these are going to provide an energy or nutrients that it might be less practical to use real food in the moment. And so on the court, we know that sport drinks are designed to be ideally drank during sports. And so we're going to replace our carbohydrate and our electrolytes and fluid and things like that that are lost during training or that are utilized during training or during a game. So that would be an example of a sport food that we might consider in that category. And then the last category is probably where things get a little bit more diverse and a little more questionable, and we see more high-risk supplements that fit into this category. And that's going to be supplements that directly enhance exercise capacity or maybe provide an indirect benefit. And that could be through like recovery. That could be through body composition changes, like influencing muscle or body fat. That could be influencing other sport-specific goals like jumping higher or getting to a ball quicker or recovering more quickly in between that long rally and our next play or something along those lines. And energy drinks actually could probably fit into either our sport foods or our sport supplements, our performance enhancing supplements, just because sometimes they have other ingredients in them that might be categorized outside of that. And caffeine, I think, is more of a performance enhancing supplement, and that's how we'll talk about it. But they could be promoted as almost like a drink to have, like a sport food that would be in lieu of something else. So I think all of you are aware that adolescence is this kind of time period of significant physical development, metabolic development, hormonal fluctuations, maturation of all of these different systems within the body. A lot of physiology going on, certainly a lot going on cognitively and mentally as well. That's not my area of expertise, but I think, we all kind of can understand that sort of process that these athletes are going through. And all of these different processes need to be supported with nutrients. When you specifically consider things like bones that are growing, muscles that are building and growing and repairing, and kind of their connection to the developing brain that is for sure growing as well, all the fluctuating hormones that might be circulating through the system, the body's capacity to store different nutrients. So as we think about storage, then we think about how are we depositing fat? Where are we depositing that fat? How is that influencing the body? As well as kind of that ability to build muscle and store or create muscle from those amino acids that we are consuming. And all of these different areas are going to impact the future health of the adolescents, and all of them are going to be impacted by what they put in their body, and that's going to be food and supplements. So I just like to kind of keep in mind that adolescent tissue is different than adult tissue. And that's kind of one of those cornerstones that I will always go back to. And the really challenging part about this age group is that it's difficult ethically to test out different things on this group. So to get approval to test supplements on a 12-year-old is not always looked upon positively, because there's not a lot of people who want to let their children be test subjects to see if something might harm them or if something is safe. And so there's a lot of just questions around that and things that we want to think about. Well, if this impacts adult tissue this way, then will that impact an adolescent or a growing body or their tissues the same way. So we don't always have the answers to those questions, but they're questions that we don't want to forget for sure. And I think we all know also that there's so much opportunity here and potential for increasing performance and increasing your expertise in your sport, because we are maturing and their bones are growing longer and they're getting taller, and their capacity to, build that muscle and grow and recover more quickly is all happening at these times. But all of that is combined with their training programs and their nutrition, and then, of course, their sleep and their rest regimens as well. And that's what enables the body to sort of function at its best during this time period. And so keeping in mind sort of who we're talking about, I think, is always important, and just a reminder to go back to, and that we don't always know, and there's not always a lot of data to kind of support use of different things in this group. So I would imagine also that many of you already know the answer to why adolescents want to take different dietary supplements, and especially sport supplements. Think that in general, athletic performance seems to be the most common reason that they're taking supplements. So they want to get better at a variety of different things that could be general, like their exercise capacity, their recovery, building muscle, or they could be very sport specific as well. But in addition to that, many of them are trying to pursue a physical ideal, and that might be something that's realistic or not realistic for them based upon their genetics, based upon just what they're asking their body to do and what they're capable of doing at this age as well. And then certainly based on what they see in or the older athletes and what they see maybe in the media and things like that. So there's also a good amount of pressure, both from peers, from their social groups, from marketing, and it could even be from their team or from their, teammates, and maybe even from some coaches. So I think it's one of those things to kind of take a step back and just sort of think about some of the ways that we talk to athletes and what are those expectations of them, and how is that influencing them when they are looking to make some of these choices. So thinking a little bit, I guess, beyond what are those reasons that athletes are taking supplements, athletes often don't realize that they have this natural environment at this age in which testosterone, estrogen, growth hormone are all in a really natural and optimal level for them to grow, develop, perform, recover, build muscle. And so you can kind of take a look at this graph down here. It's a little bit smaller, and obviously it's going to vary with males and females a little bit. But this time period in an athlete's life, when all of these hormones are really at the most optimal level, they need a great training regimen, and they need great nutrients to support that hormonal environment. And they can really benefit from that hormonal environment without supplements, probably. And the hormones are actually probably more powerful than any supplement that they can take at this age, if they can optimize kind of what they already have and what they're already working with. So I think that's always just a really good reminder as well, is that what they're putting in their body supports that hormonal and growth environment. And those hormones are really powerful. And as those of you who are a little bit older know, that you probably wish you could go back and have those hormonal levels when you get to even be, 30 or 40 or so or beyond that. And it would be, it's really beneficial to all of those tissues and all of that capacity for performance. So the last part to consider is, when is it appropriate? And if it is appropriate, is it beneficial for these adolescent athletes to take some type of maybe sport or dietary supplement? And the best way that I can answer that is probably to help navigate just some of the general ideas around supplements. And there's lots of opportunity for more questions later, but I'm just going to target a couple right now. I think the first one is just, how do you know when you have a trusted supplement? and it can be really tough to know. But some of the key things that we're interested in is, does the bottle contain what the label states? Does each pill or scoop have the same amount that is identified on the container, on that supplement label that we discussed? And do each of the pills have the same thing as each other? Because there's actually a lot of data to show that sometimes there's a lot of variation from pill to pill within a bottle. Does a product contain anything extra that's not intended to be in there? Or could it potentially be contaminated with something that's not on the label? And there is a good amount of data out there to show that probably 10 to 15% of dietary supplements have things in them that are not on the label or that are not intended to be in there. And there's certainly a good amount of data as well to say that the amount that is listed on the label is not actually the amount that's in the container. And some have more in it and some have less. So those are two different issues at different ends of the spectrum, probably. And so there are some companies out there, and it's called third-party testing, that help you understand whether you could trust a supplement or not. It's not 100% foolproof, though. But it does show me anyway that a supplement company cares and that they're willing to go the extra kind of step to say, hey, we went to somebody else, we asked them to look at what our product tells them, and we feel pretty good about that. And we're going to put something on our label to show you that we've gone those extra steps. So there's a variety of different companies out there. Depends on what you're trying to understand there. Is it simply what's in the label is what's on the bottle? Is important, or do we want to make sure that there are no banned substances that an athlete could potentially come into contact with, in which they could fail a drug test through USADA or WADA? And we'll talk about that just a little bit more. I think the next part is that supplements should be used to supplement what an athlete eats and how they train, and that those are really the foundation and they're the fundamentals. So keeping in mind that an energy drink is not in lieu of breakfast, nor is whey protein a better option than eating foods rich in protein. Instead, it just might be that the protein powder is easy to throw in my backpack and I have it available to me after training or after a game, in which my turkey sandwich is probably not going to be the greatest option if I just threw that in my backpack and kind of a warm, stinky environment later in the day when I might want that. Similarly, creatine is not in place of a training session. And so I think that's really important to consider as well. Creatine is actually utilized best when we're fueling training with food and when we have an appropriate training regimen that's going to optimize our ability to utilize those creatine stores. The third part of that is timing, and timing is important for some supplements, less so for others. But certainly we can talk about that with maybe more specific guidelines around it, but we don't always just kind of throw something into our, mouth just because it's convenient, but ideally there's a purpose around it and there's a timing that makes sense. And the last part is that supplement regulations vary by different governing organizations. So depending on whether you are working with athletes who are in a testing pool for USADA or WADA, if you're working with those in our U17, our U19 groups, then we're concerned about banned substances. If you're working with athletes who are in middle school, I think we're still concerned with banned substances, but probably there's not anybody who's going to test them to see, are they taking anything that's banned? And then certainly when you get into NCAA, or maybe you get into your different clubs in your high schools, they have policies around them. And I think those are really just important to be aware of and to follow. So the last section I'm going to focus on are 3 different sport supplements. They tend to be the most common, I would say, probably for adolescent athletes, or at least that people and those young individuals have a lot of questions around. Keeping in mind that this is by no means a comprehensive list, and there's so many supplements out there that I just sort of tried to narrow it in and give you guys just sort of something, food for thought to sort of take with you after the end of the presentation. So when I think about protein powder, there's all different types of protein powder out there. You can buy all different brands. You can get it at pretty much every store that you go to. I think you could probably even get it at a 7-Eleven these days if you wanted to. And they come in usually plant-based forms or more of an animal-based form, which is usually dairy-based, I would say. So your casein and whey are coming from dairy, and then all of our others are coming from legumes and grains and different plants. The one thing to keep in mind is that leucine is the amino acid that's probably most important if we're looking for protein powder to help us with any type of muscle building and muscle repair. And so muscles go through a breakdown and a rebuilding process, and leucine helps sort of stimulate that process to allow muscles to get stronger and to get bigger. And so the leucine content can vary in different types of protein powder. And that's one thing that I always like to look at on the label is a protein powder that might share that with you. And so kind of your ideal amount, and this is much more based on adult studies than adolescent studies, but is usually around 3 grams of leucine. And so our whey typically is going to provide that. Soy is a little bit less, and then some of our plant proteins actually have a really nice amount of leucine in them as well. And so I think that a lot of things that are out there on the market do have a good amount in there. It's just something to pay attention to, again, depending on what that goal is. So we know that we need protein, in particular the amino acids are those building blocks to create new muscle. And when that's paired with a resistance training program and other nutrients, so total calories as well as your carbohydrate and vitamins and minerals and all of the color on your plate and things like that, that's when protein can do its job the best. So typically taking protein in after training, lifting, or a game is going to be your timing if you're looking for that one specific goal. Otherwise, we know that we need protein throughout the day just to meet our protein needs, and that should be a part of all of our meals and snacks. When we look at amounts, again, we don't have a ton of data here on adolescent athletes, but I really like the idea of looking at grams per kilogram of body weight. And so kilograms is kind of standard internationally, but typically we can, take our body weight and divide it by about 2.2, and you can get your body weight in kilograms. So there's just an example there, but that might be something that an athlete could consume after a training session. I think the concerns and the risks here are just that it shouldn't be selected in lieu of other food sources that are rich in protein. So ideally we want to get as much from real food as we can, but this is just a really nice portable option. More isn't always better. However, during this time period, athletes need a good amount of protein in order for those bodies to develop and their bones to grow and their muscles to grow and their brain to grow and things like that. So that amount is really designed for building muscle, but that's not the amount that athletes need in this age group just to for their daily needs. So just to kind of keep that in mind that those are separate needs and concerns there. So creatine is the next one that I wanted to discuss, and it's somewhat commonly used, I would say, in adolescents, maybe about 5 to 20% or so on average of middle school and high school athletes either have taken or take creatine on a regular basis. Usually the older ones in that age group and males tend to be our more prevalent consumers than females or those who sit on the lower end of that age range. And it's naturally occurring in the body, but we all can also consume it in food. I would say that when we take it in as a supplemental form, creatine monohydrate is still the most effective form, especially when we are trying to achieve certain goals. And that would be trying to improve our exercise capacity, I would say. So lots of different reasons why we might take creatine, and I think we're learning more and more about it in all different types of tissue, but I'm going to focus here on kind of athletes and strength and hypertrophy, and then maybe some sport-specific explosive movements in volleyball that might be serving or digging or passing or, just any of those explosive movements. I think creatine could be beneficial for because it's our very short-term, high-intensity movements, or even in the weight room in which we could benefit from increasing those muscle stores from. What's interesting in this age group is that the performance data actually only exists in soccer and swimming. So when you do kind of a search of all the literature out there, there's really no data in adolescent volleyball players. So I think that is interesting in and of itself. I think we can translate some of that data over to other sports for sure and understand that we could get a performance benefit. And we also have some longer term data also looking at, kind of the health and safety. And we do have some data showing over, I think it's up to maybe like 11 months of adolescent athletes in this age group taking creatine without really any adverse effects. So I think there could be a benefit there for sure. The amount and kind of when you take it, I would say depends a little bit on what the goals are, how quickly you're looking to benefit from that. And typically a quicker loading regimen might take place over 5 days, and a longer loading regimen might take place over about a month. And if we're going to do a quicker regimen, then we're going to take, 4 to 5 times a day of some creatine. And if we're doing a longer loading regimen, then we'll just take it once daily. And the timing actually doesn't probably matter that much with creatine, but typically athletes will take it before or after training, just so it's paired with something that they remember to do and not leaving it to another time during the day. So there's limited data in this population. I think that's pretty clear. We know that there's also probably a little bit lower uptake in children and adolescents than in the adult population. So there's a lot of data to support that we can increase our muscle creatine stores with supplemental creatine in adults. That process might be a little less effective in children. Typically, we have responders and non-responders when we think about creatine, and that's the same with children as well as adults and adolescents. And so there's some individuals who take creatine and they just don't get this response and they don't see an increase in those stores. And sometimes that has to do with what those stores look like before they start supplementing. We know that vegetarian and vegan athletes tend to have lower muscle creatine levels to begin with. So often they are highest responders. So if you do have some athletes who have those different eating patterns, then again, that's always a really great conversation, whether it's a great place for you to be making those recommendations or not. It's certainly worth those kids asking some more questions, I would say, especially in the physiques of our volleyball players, because they tend to be tall and long-limbed, and they some of them struggle with putting muscle mass on in general just because of those components of their joint spaces and, what their muscles look like and how long their bones are. And the last thing about creatine, I would say, is that there should be an optimal hydration regimen in place and diet before supplementing with creatine. So again, creatine is not in lieu of any food that we're eating. It's certainly to supplement and really is more of a way that we can recover more quickly in between high intensity exercise bouts. So it's not fueling those muscle contractions, but it's providing an energy source that allows us to recover more quickly. And whenever we store creatine within the muscle, it's going to be stored with water. And so we need to be really well hydrated before we initiate any type of loading with creatine. And then we need to continue really good hydration habits with extra fluid when we're taking creatine on a regular basis. And then the last one is caffeine. And caffeine's one of my favorites, I think, because it just shows up in so many different places. And it's our most frequently used substance in the world. And a lot of people derive a lot of pleasure in drinking caffeinated beverages, and lots of people like to talk about caffeine. So it's always kind of fun. I think the differences to me is there's a social aspect of caffeine, and then there's a performance aspect of caffeine. And even with the national team, those are really hard to separate sometimes. So for example, the athlete who loves to get up and just have coffee in the morning, but then wants to see a performance benefit from caffeine in their morning training session, sometimes that timing is a little off. If I have my coffee at 7, but I don't get on the court until 9, and I'm on the court until 11:30, then we're probably not benefiting as much from that caffeine as we could be, because what you'll notice is caffeine tends to peak around 30 to 60 minutes after consuming it. In whatever form, usually, except gum. If you have caffeinated gum, we can usually absorb that a little bit more quickly because it's absorbed through the mouth and not through the digestive system. So I think that the timing for performance is important if that's your goal. If you're socially using caffeine, then that's probably a different scenario there. We know that caffeine is found in a lot of naturally, occurring foods and beverages, but it's also added to a lot of things. And I think that's where we need to be looking at some of those supplement labels and understanding what is the amount in there. And if it doesn't say, I would be highly cautious. If it says that caffeine is included or another form of caffeine is included in there and they don't use that term, then I think that I would be cautious of that product. We also know that athletes are consuming a lot of energy drinks, and that's a hot topic, and sometimes that's in lieu of breakfast. So I sort of go back to that conversation that because it has B vitamins in there and says it's an energy drink, it's not actually providing us with the nutrients that we need for muscle contraction and for energy to sustain throughout a full practice session or a lifting session. But maybe that's a great option and a great timing for getting some caffeine in there to reduce fatigue and to have reaction time quicker and to, be able to focus more during practice. And so I think there are definitely some benefits there. I think it's just there's a lot of questions surrounding it, and some of it probably goes back to age as well. Where is that developing brain? I think we know that there are no positive short or long-term effects of caffeinated products on the developing brain. That's not to say there's only negative effects. It's just that we know there's really no benefit there. So that's something to consider. We don't have enough data on caffeine to say that there's a safe dose that we would recommend. So with adults, I think we have a lot of data on caffeine, and you can look at all different ranges of milligrams per kilogram of body weight and what are those benefits and how are we going to see them. And they range from as low as like 1 milligram per kilogram up to maybe even like 9 milligrams per kilogram, which is a lot of caffeine, especially if you have a heavier body weight. We don't have that information in this age group. So instead, what they've said is to either limit it to 100 milligrams per day. And 100 milligrams per day could be maybe like a soda, or it could be a small cup of coffee, or it could be like one espresso shot or some things like that. What it probably is not is a Rockstar, a Celsius, anything along those lines, or maybe like your big gulp of soda or your 64 ounces of soda. And so just, I think, keeping in mind that caffeine adds up throughout the day and that tissue has to absorb it and it has to excrete it then. It has to metabolize it and then excrete it and deal with whatever you put in there. So one dose is one thing, but having it throughout the day, I think, is another consideration. And so lots of times I just like to ask athletes, like, how many caffeinated beverages are you having in a day? And that's just a great conversation starter. And so another way to look at that would be less than 2.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So again, just another example there. But I think depending on the age range, typically we're looking at less than 200 or less than 100 milligrams per day. And that's not in one sitting. So that's per day. So I just want to keep that in mind. And then just keeping in mind also that there's little data on this age group. There is a genetic response to caffeine that's gene driven in adolescents, children, and adults. Some people metabolize caffeine very rapidly. Some people metabolize caffeine very slowly. And so if any of you are familiar with somebody who says, I can't have caffeine past noon, they're probably a very slow metabolizer of caffeine. And there's other individuals who seem to metabolize it very quickly and they can rid the system of it very quickly. Keeping in mind that some of the issues might be anxiety, overstimulation, increased aggression, poor sleep. I think my big concern is lots of times the timing of training, the timing of games, when we might be taking that caffeine in, because I do think there could be a benefit that later in the match, after maybe the third set, if you're going to go to 4 or 5, that caffeine could be really beneficial, depending on how long that game goes. However, if it's an afternoon or evening game, match, it's just a challenge there is how is that going to influence someone's sleep? And so what are the benefits there to that? Okay. Lastly, I think with athletes and parents, I think the goal is to open up the conversation about dietary supplements. What are you hearing? What are you reading? What do you have questions about? Can you answer them? If not, do you have a resource for them? We have a caffeine fact sheet on our Team USA website. We have a lot of other fact sheets as well that you could find there. That might be a starting point. It is targeted a little bit more to understanding some of those banned substances and what those testing programs are that I mentioned. But I think that it just helps you ask some questions and open up that conversation.